Here's something that sounds backwards the first time you hear it. The more skilled an entire field of competitors becomes, the more luck ends up deciding who actually wins. Not less, more. This is called the paradox of skill. And once you understand the mechanism behind it, you'll never read a quarterly leaderboard the same way again. Start with the simple case. When skill gaps between competitors are wide, the most skilled person wins reliably, over and over, almost regardless of circumstance. A chess grandmaster beats a casual weekend player essentially every single time. Nobody calls that luck. The skill gap is simply too large for randomness to meaningfully interfere with the outcome. Now shrink that gap. As everyone in a field gets better, competitors converge toward a similar, high level of ability. The room for skill alone to separate outcomes gets smaller and smaller because everyone is closer to everyone else's ceiling. But someone still has to win. Someone still finishes first and someone still finishes last. With less room for skill to explain that gap, random variance rushes in to fill the space that's left over. The economist and investment strategist Michael Mauboussin has written extensively about this exact pattern, framing it as a skill-luck continuum that stretches from pure chance at one end, think roulette, to pure skill at the other end, think chess. Most real competitive activities, including business performance, sit somewhere in between, and, crucially, where an activity sits on that continuum can shift over time as the whole field of competitors improves. There's a genuinely famous example of this from baseball, one that shows up constantly in discussions of the paradox of skill. In 1941, Ted Williams hit 406 for a full season, one of the last times any player crossed the fabled 400 batting average threshold. Nobody has done it since, across more than 80 years of professional baseball. The obvious explanation feels like decline. Hitters today must simply be worse than they were in Williams's era. The evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould studied this exact puzzle and reached the opposite conclusion, laid out in his essay collection on the topic. Batting average is a comparison against the league's pitching, not an absolute measure of hitting skill in isolation. As the entire sport professionalized, as scouting, coaching, nutrition, and training all improved dramatically across every single team, the gap between the best hitters and the best pitchers narrowed sharply. Both sides of the game got better together. Hitters today are almost certainly more skilled in an absolute sense than hitters from the 1940s. But the shrinking gap between hitting skill and pitching skill leaves less room for any single hitter to tower statistically above the rest of a now much stronger league. The extreme outlier season becomes structurally harder to produce, not because talent declined, but because the whole field converged upward together. That single sports example maps directly onto something every manager running a genuinely strong team eventually runs into. Picture a sales team where every single person has been carefully hired, well-trained, and has real demonstrated skill. At the start of any given quarter, the gap in raw ability between your top performer and your 10th ranked performer might be genuinely small. Both are good at their job, both know the product, both handle objections competently. So what actually determines who finishes ranked first this quarter and who finishes ranked 10th? Increasingly, it's not skill. It's which accounts happen to be assigned to which rep. It's whether a client's internal budget cycle happened to land favorably this quarter. It's dozens of small, uncontrollable variables that have nothing to do with who is actually the better salesperson, and everything to do with variance filling the gap that skill differences used to fill when the team was less uniformly strong. Here's the part that should genuinely change how you run performance reviews. If you promote, reward, or fire purely based on a single quarter's ranking inside an already strong team, you are very often rewarding whoever happened to get lucky that specific period and quietly punishing someone equally skilled who simply had a rough few months through no real fault of their own. Worse, the person you reward for a lucky quarter learns the wrong lesson entirely, crediting their own genius for what was substantially variance, while the person you punish for an unlucky quarter learns to play defensively going forward, second-guessing decisions that were never actually the problem. The practical fix is straightforward once you see the underlying pattern clearly. Look at performance over a meaningfully longer window, specifically once a team's baseline skill is already high. A single quarter's ranking on a weak, uneven team still tells you something real about relative ability, because the skill gaps are wide enough for variance to matter less. That exact same single quarter's ranking on a strong, even team tells you dramatically less, because variance has taken over more of what used to be explained by skill. The stronger and more even your team becomes, paradoxically, the less you should trust any single period's ranking as a clean measure of who's actually better, and the more you should trust the trend across several periods stacked together instead. What's genuinely counterintuitive here, and worth sitting with for a second, is that improving your team as a whole actually makes short-term rankings a worse management tool, not a better one. A manager who doesn't understand the paradox of skill will often double down on shorter and shorter review cycles, precisely as their team gets stronger, chasing a signal that's actually getting noisier, not clearer, the better everyone gets. There's a related statistical concept worth knowing by name here, because it compounds the exact same problem: regression to the mean. Whenever an outcome is partly explained by variance rather than pure skill, an extreme result in one period tends to be followed by a less extreme result in the next, purely as a statistical artifact, with no coaching, intervention, or change in effort required to produce that pattern. A salesperson who has a spectacular quarter, driven partly by favorable variance, will very often look worse the following quarter, even with identical underlying skill and effort, simply because extreme results regress back toward the average over time. Managers who don't know this concept by name often invent a story to explain the dip, a loss of motivation, complacency after a big win, when the far more boring and far more accurate explanation is that variance simply cuts both ways, and last quarter's high roll was never going to repeat indefinitely. Mauboussin's skill-luck continuum offers a useful diagnostic for figuring out where any given activity sits, and it's worth applying directly to your own team's work rather than just sports. One practical test: in an activity dominated by skill, the best performers tend to keep winning over long stretches, because their edge is real and durable. In an activity dominated by luck, this quarter's top performer and next quarter's top performer are often nearly unrelated people, because there was no durable edge to carry forward, just favorable variance that happened to land on someone. Applying that same test internally, tracking whether your own top quarterly performers tend to repeat as top performers over several consecutive periods, tells you directly how much of your team's current ranking system is actually measuring skill, versus how much of it is just recording who got lucky this specific stretch. Professional golf provides another well-documented example of this exact pattern, sitting closer to the luck end of the spectrum than most fans are ranked. Golf's biggest tournaments are frequently won by players who weren't ranked among the pre-tournament favorites, not because the favorites suddenly became bad golfers, but because a 4-round tournament is a genuinely short sample, short enough that a hot putting streak or a few fortunate bounces can meaningfully outweigh the real durable skill gap between the world's best player and the 40th best player in the field. Stretch the same competitors out over an entire season, or several seasons, instead of one single tournament, and the true skill hierarchy reasserts itself far more reliably because a longer time horizon gives variance less room to dominate the outcome. There's a closely related finding worth knowing by name because it explains why humans are so bad at intuitively recognizing when they're looking at variance rather than skill in the first place. The hot hand fallacy, studied in a famous 1985 paper by psychologists Thomas Gilovich, Robert Vallone, and Amos Tversky. The researchers examined real shooting data from professional basketball players and found that a player who had just made several shots in a row was no more likely to make their next shot than a player who had just missed several in a row, contrary to the strong, near-universal belief among players, coaches, and fans that players go through genuine hot streaks. Human pattern recognition is so tuned to finding meaning in sequences that it reliably manufactures a skill narrative. This player is locked in right now out of what is substantially random variance in a genuinely high-skill activity. That exact same misattribution happens constantly in business performance reviews. A manager watching a salesperson close 3 deals in a row develops a strong intuitive sense that the person is currently unusually skilled or motivated, when a meaningful share of that streak on an already highly skilled team is the same statistical noise the Gilovich study found in professional basketball shooting data. This isn't unique to sales teams or professional sports. Any competitive environment where skill gaps have compressed over time, elite-level surgery outcomes, top-tier college admissions, professional trading desks staffed entirely by strong performers shows the same pattern. Once everyone in the room is genuinely good, a single period's outcome tells you far less about ability than it feels like it does in the moment. There's one more compounding trap worth naming here, because it distorts how managers interpret performance data even when they're already trying to account for variance, survivorship bias. During the Second World War, statistician Abraham Wald was asked to help the military decide where to add armor to returning bomber aircraft, based on examining the pattern of bullet holes across planes that had made it back from missions. The obvious instinct was to reinforce the areas showing the most damage on returning planes. Wald's insight, now taught in nearly every statistics course, was the opposite. The planes that had been hit in those exact locations and failed to return weren't in the sample at all because they'd been shot down. The bullet holes on the surviving planes marked the areas a bomber could take damage and still make it home. The areas with no damage on any returning plane were the truly critical ones, because planes hit there never made it back to be counted. The data he was looking at had already been filtered by survival itself. The same distortion quietly shapes how managers read performance data on a strong, evenly skilled team. Looking only at your current top performers to figure out what separates success from failure ignores everyone who left the team, burned out, or was pushed out along the way, some of whom may have had comparable underlying skill but ran into a stretch of bad variance at the wrong moment and never got the benefit of a longer evaluation window to recover from it. A leaderboard built entirely from survivors tells you what worked for the people still standing. It tells you almost nothing about how many equally capable people didn't survive an unlucky stretch that a slightly longer, fairer evaluation window would have smoothed out. This has a very direct, practical implication for how a manager should study their own best-performing employees. It's tempting to interview your current top performers, extract whatever habits or behaviors they describe, and try to train the rest of the team to copy those exact habits. That approach quietly assumes every one of those top performers succeeded primarily because of skill and behavior, rather than partly because of variance that happened to land in their favor. Some of what a top performer describes as their winning habit may be a perfectly reasonable practice that genuinely helps. Some of it may simply be a story a talented, hardworking, and also somewhat lucky person has told themselves to explain an outcome that was never fully within their control in the first place. And a manager, copying that story wholesale onto the rest of the team, is quietly copying survivorship bias directly into a training program. A more reliable version of this exercise looks at what your top performers did consistently across many periods, not just the specific period where they happened to rank first, and compares it against what your consistently mid-ranked performers were doing during those exact same stretches. Behaviors that show up across a top performer's good quarters and their merely average quarters alike are far more likely to be genuine skill. Behaviors that only show up during their single best quarter and disappear again once that quarter passes are a much stronger candidate for variance dressed up as insight, and are exactly the kind of lesson a manager should be far more cautious about rolling out to the rest of the team as a proven best practice. The uncomfortable, honest version of this whole idea is that on a genuinely strong, evenly matched team, some real share of who ends up ranked first this specific quarter was always going to come down to circumstances, nobody in the room fully controlled, and pretending otherwise, in either direction, rewarding the winner as a genius or quietly writing off the 10th place finisher as simply less capable teaches your team the wrong lesson about what actually separates good work from good fortune. None of this is an argument against measuring performance at all, or against having a ranking system in the first place. Rankings are still useful, and top performers on a strong team are very often genuinely excellent, not just lucky. The argument is narrower and more specific. The stronger your team gets, the more skeptical you should become of any single period's ranking as the full story, and the more weight you should shift toward patterns that hold up consistently across many periods stacked together, rather than whichever single quarter happens to be sitting in front of you when review season arrives. That single shift in how you weigh evidence costs nothing to implement and quietly makes every performance conversation you have from that point forward considerably fairer, precisely because it's finally measuring the thing you actually meant to measure in the first place. So the next time your strongest, most evenly skilled team wraps up a quarter, resist the urge to treat that single ranking as gospel. Once your team's skill level is already high, judge people over several months of stacked results, not the single period that happened to just wrap up. That's where the real signal actually lives, quietly waiting underneath the noise of any one period, for anyone patient enough to actually look for it, quarter after quarter, rather than grabbing whichever convenient, confident-sounding explanation happens to be sitting closest at hand instead. Follow along for more of these.